Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Breda, and I will be your moderator. Today's presentation is the brain and reading, why learning to read is hard and what to do about it. Again, my name is Paul Breda. I'm responsible for K-12 educational partnerships for Readable English. For over 20 years, I've been committed to continuous improvement in public education, as a school board member and as a provider of products and services that improve instruction and student achievement. Today we're going to talk about literacy, an important topic that will define the success of our schools and the future of our students. So let's get started with the presentation. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers who will guide us through this fascinating and complex subject. Tammy Miller is a literacy warrior, as shown in her extensive background. She has spent 30-plus years in education in many roles, including teacher, principal, and director of elementary education in the public schools, and also as a nationally sought-after consultant brought in to turn around failing schools in highly complex circumstances. Tammy's combined knowledge of systemic change, instruction, and curriculum and school operations provide the tools schools need to improve student outcomes. Tammy received her Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education with a reading endorsement at Indiana University and Masters in Educational Leadership at Butler University. And our second speaker is Becky Mungel, a 25-year veteran of education with an emphasis in research-based interventions and teaching techniques. She spent the first 7 years of her teaching career in both elementary and middle school and has been an elementary principal for the past 18 years. She currently works as an elementary principal in southern Indiana. Becky works tirelessly to address the literacy problem facing our schools and successfully utilizes Readable English to support struggling readers. I'll be available to answer questions in the chat or for follow-up after the webinar. So thank you very much, and I will now pass our virtual microphone over to Tammy.
First thing I would like to say is welcome, and we are absolutely thrilled that you are here. Today, we hope to bring you a message that inspires you, that there is something we can do about the literacy crisis for the students, children, and adults in our life who struggle to read proficiently. As Paul said, I've been around a while, and I've really had a lot of different roles in education. And yes, most recently, I've been doing a lot of national consulting in struggling schools across the country in a lot of different locations with different circumstances. I learned early on that if a student cannot read proficiently, their options in life become very limited. So I made it my life's work in whatever role I was fulfilling to focus on literacy for the students. So regardless of what the job was, I was always taking it back to the root cause situation with the literacy deficit. At one point, I took a group of university professors from Indiana University, as well as public educators across the country to see different locations for the best literacy programs available. I've gone after grant funds to buy the best programs of the time available. I have sought donations to bring the best programs to our students, and everything that I can do to go after what the research was telling us at that time and what we knew was going to be really best for our kids to get them reading. But the sad thing to me is that no matter what we did or how hard we worked, and I know how hard our educators work, we made some progress, but we really did not get kids to grade level, especially if they were multiple years behind. Through all of this time in education, I continue to ask the question of how can we work so hard and give our students so much, but we haven't really changed the outcome for them. So in my current work as a school turnaround specialist, when I go into the schools to help and to problem solve, to see what we can do to make things better for students, it's always the same root cause. The root cause is always reading. the students are not able to read proficiently. In 2015, a book landed in my lap. It was truly serendipitous, and it was about a new invention in teaching reading. I immediately realized that it was based on the way the brain actually processes words and the way the brain reads. I also saw that it could be a much faster way for students to learn to read proficiently. I believed so much that this innovation could impact our reading crisis that I made a career change and I took a position as a curriculum director for alternative education and set about the journey to see if we had some answers to the literacy crisis. In fact, I believe that most of you on this call today are probably here because you've accepted the moral imperative. You understand that it is our responsibility to ensure that our students can read proficiently. So we all want to make a difference for our students. In fact, it's true that we're part of a society that's always trying to improve, especially in the quality of life or the dimensions of well-being. But take a look at this slide and think about this. Which of these items has not really improved in the past 30 years? If you take computers, for example, most adults actually have a handheld computer these days, and it's a phone. Consider travel. Many of the cars being manufactured today come about with actually a GPS system built in. Or Elon Musk. Elon Musk is pursuing space travel and underground tunnel travel and having success. But then think about the literacy rate of our nation's students. This is troubling. And I think you already know that no, we really haven't improved in the literacy rate of our nation's students. Why is it that learning to read is just so hard? Well, there's really at least 4 reasons that reading English is so difficult, and none of them have anything to do with the student's intelligence, but they have everything to do with the problems that have not been successfully addressed with learning to read. The first problem, or the first reason, is this. English is one of the most difficult languages to learn to read. When I first saw this, I was shocked. Professor Philip Seymour from the Dundee University conducted this study. It was one of the world's largest cross-national study of students learning to read their native language in their first year of school. If you look across the graph, you can see that most of the languages actually had an 80 to 100% accuracy rate in that first year that students were learning to read their native language. But look at the English language. It's only a 35% accuracy rate. In fact, it takes about 2.5 years for a student to learn to read English proficiently or with accuracy. This is shocking when you really give pause to think about how much time this takes and how difficult it really is. The English language is not phonetic, but all of the other languages are phonetic. The English language is very complex and has many inconsistencies. In fact, we have 26 letters that make 42 sounds. And sometimes, those letters make more than one sound. For example, the letter U makes up to 7 sounds, or the letter C makes 5 sounds. Now consider that sometimes letters are silent. You see sign, climb, knee, island, those all have silent letters. But take the word sign, for example. If you consider related words such as signal or signature, the G's are pronounced in those words, but not in the word sign. How does a reader know this without experience or without someone telling them the correct pronunciation? It's not always clear where the syllable breaks occur in our words. So for example, in the word mishap, we have the digraph for SH, and it's actually pronounced mishap, but if we followed the rule, it would be mishap. And then take a look at the words baked and naked. Baked is actually a 1-syllable word, and naked is a 2-syllable word. So we have lots of inconsistent rules. For example, the silent E at the end of a word makes the vowel say its own name. This is the magic E rule, some of you might remember, or maybe you teach it. The rule for cove, cone, gave, and five works. But look at all the exceptions. It doesn't work for all of those exceptions, and there are many more as well. And more inconsistent rules. When two vowels go walking, the first does the talking. Just like in the word both, the O sound for the OA, sail, the A sound for the AI, and in beat, the E for the EA. But look at all the exceptions, and again, just a few. These are just a few of those exceptions. So all of this begins to put a huge cognitive load on the brain. So when you're thinking about what it really takes just to be able to read 1,000 of the most common words, 380 of those words are phonetic, 350 of them follow a rule, and 270 are exceptions. So in fact, if you added up all of the rules and exceptions, 26 alphabet sounds, 12 digraphs, 45 rules, 270 exceptions, it's actually over 350 rules and exceptions that the brain has to recall instantaneously in order for us to read with automaticity. It's overwhelming, and the demand is too great. So this is actually called the cognitive load theory. Dr. John Sweller of the University of New South Wales in Australia is the father of the cognitive load theory. And what the cognitive load theory is telling us is that the working memory it does not have the capacity to handle too much all at once. If that occurs, it doesn't make it into the long-term memory. So you can imagine in reading, our goal is for students to be able to access a high word volume from the long-term memory in order for all of those words to be translated in the brain and then comprehended. But let's take a look at some of the other language that we're seeing here. For example, the redundancy effect. The redundancy effect is simply when students are presented with unnecessary information, it clogs up the working memory. So we talked about the magic E rule. This would be a perfect example. So that working memory can become overwhelmed with trying to figure out whether or not the magic E rule applies to a word. The split attention effect is also confusing to students. This means that when they're trying to process two or more pieces of information simultaneously, it puts another burden on the working memory. Research suggests that the brain can only recall 7 items at one time, making it nearly impossible to apply the multitude of rules and exceptions that a student needs to know to be able to read with automaticity. In a lot of ways, it seems like a miracle that we've learned how to read. So with the cognitive load theory in reading, it can be summarized with these 3 key points. If the cognitive load is too great, the working memory cannot process new words quickly enough to move them to the long-term memory. The second key point is that word volume will be greatly reduced when the transfer from working memory to long-term memory is not happening with accuracy and with efficiency. And thirdly, a schema must be created in the working memory that allows for automated recall from long-term memory. In other words, strings of letters become words. If the cognitive load is too great, a schema is not developed. So far, we have looked at the problem of the English language and its complexities. We have looked at the second problem regarding cognitive load as a result of all of those inconsistencies in the English language. And now there's a third problem with learning to read, and that is the idea of fossilization. So fossilization simply means that a student has learned a word incorrectly, and they stored it in their long-term memory incorrectly. Because the pronunciation is often not clear, unless we're sitting with the student to assist them, they do a lot of self-teaching, and they determine some of the words on their own. But frequently, they teach themselves incorrectly, and the words are not accurate. So those words then become fossilized in the long-term memory. Errors in general take time to correct, but a fossilized error may never be corrected unless the learner sees a reason to do so. So for example, if it's seriously hindering their reading or their communication. And finally, one of the last reasons that reading is hard, because it's very difficult for students to have success. And when we don't have success, we lose our motivation. There's something called the virtuous cycle of learning. There are many references to it in the research and in different domains, but Daniel Willingham mentioned this in one of his books. In 2015, his book, Raising Kids Who Read. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, psychology professor, and he talked about this virtuous cycle of learning. And so you can simply imagine what it means. If we have a small amount of success with something, it motivates us to want more or to do more. We really see this with our students or with our children who are involved with video games. They see a little bit of success and they want to find the answer to do better. They want to level up. There's a reason to level up, and they see that it's achievable. What often happens with reading is that they're not seeing the success, so it diminishes their motivation and their interest. When we can get them small increments of success and they see it and feel it and know they're making progress, they become more hooked into reading. They have accuracy, so they are becoming better readers, and they want to become better readers, and they enjoy what they're reading. They're hooked into that virtuous cycle of learning. But overcoming the 4 challenges of learning to read make it difficult to get to this point. So I want to take you back to the nation's report card. We talked earlier about the 3 things, or we asked the question, what are the 3 things that have not improved in 30 years? Well, back to the item, the literacy rate for our children have not improved. This data has been collected since 1992 by NAEP, the National Association for Educational Progress. And if you look at this data, you'll see that it really hasn't changed much in almost 30 years. 65% of our 4th graders and 66% of our 8th graders are below proficient in reading. And we haven't really been able to move the needle on this, which goes back to the frustration that many of us feel and the quest that we've been on to answer this question about why is reading hard and what are we going to do? What can we do about it? Reading is hard because of the complexities of the language. The cognitive load is too great to process all the rules and exceptions. That fossilization occurs. The students incorrectly fossilize words when they can't pronounce them correctly. The virtuous learning cycle is almost non-existent for many of our struggling readers in school. They're not motivated. If we could overcome some of these difficulties and hardships, what would be possible for our students? Would we be able to take them to the next level? So as we move along here, it's become very clear that reading is an unnatural act. Our brain is hardwired to develop language, but it is not hardwired to develop reading. What's happening is that the brain is trying to connect 2 systems. The auditory system, and then also the visual word form area, or the letterbox. The brain also must learn how to understand the meaning of a written text and develop essential skills such as phonological awareness, working memory, executive functioning, and more. All of this requires fundamental changes in the brain organization. It's not pre-wired to do this. Again, adding to the complexity of how difficult it is to learn to read. What's happening in the brain is something called orthographic mapping, and it's the integration of the processes of seeing the word, saying the word, and hearing the word accurately. It's the integration of these three processes that allow us to instantly connect to the meaning of the word. So just imagine if when you see the word, it has a different spelling to it, if it's not spelled correctly, or just imagine if when you are trying to pronounce the word, you're pronouncing it incorrectly. Those two factors then make a difference of what we actually hear inside our brain and how we program those words in our long-term memory, if it even gets that far. So the orthographic mapping is key to that word accuracy. Some of you might have seen this brain before, and I love the title, Reading Pathways in the Brain. I was fascinated the first time I saw this brain, and it actually comes from Stanislas Dehaene. He is a French cognitive neuroscientist who's done extensive research on the brain and reading. And this is a simplified version of how he diagrams what is happening in the brain with reading. If you take a look over at the far right, you see in blue visual input. So this would be a reflection of the images that our brain picks up on. And then those visual inputs come in, and for words and letters, they go to the visual word form area or the letter box. So the blue leads into the red. And this is where it gets interesting. At this point, you see the arrows going two different directions. The most straightforward direction would be for this information to get carried into the green to the front of the brain for access to meaning. Sometimes what happens is that the word actually gets out into this orange part of the brain, and this is where things become bidirectional as someone is trying to access a pronunciation or an articulation of a word. This slows the process down, and we actually only have about 15 to 20 seconds at most to really program that word correctly. Can you imagine if we could shortcut and get the words to go to the front of the brain and follow this pathway with the green arrows? How much faster and accurately anyone could read English, particularly our students, and especially if they've already been struggling. This could really give them a faster way to get to that meaning and maybe even grade level text. So it's this combination of orthographic mapping and those pathways in the brain that you just took a look at that help our students become fluent readers. As soon as a word is seen, it is unconsciously and instantly recognizable. So this is what enables us to be efficient readers and able to focus on the meaning of what we read, the comprehension, instead of on the word reading. But if something breaks down in that orthographic mapping process, or if the words don't make it to the long-term memory or to the meaning part of the brain, all of this is disabled. And we're no longer making that progress in being able to read the text, be fluent with the words, and fluent enough to then lead us to comprehension. You know, another problem that can occur between orthographic mapping and the pathways in the brain is fossilization. So let's say a student makes up the meaning for themselves or the pronunciation and the spelling, and it still gets transferred, but it's wrong. So this is also a problem with comprehension because they programmed the word or mapped the word incorrectly. So for just a moment, build a bridge with your hands and make it look like this. On the right-hand side, you see word recognition. We all know that word recognition includes phonemic awareness, decoding, spelling, irregular words, and morphology. And we know that a lot of that foundational work is happening at those early grades of K2. On the left-hand side of your bridge, you see language comprehension, background knowledge, verbal reasoning, vocabulary knowledge, literacy knowledge, and language structures. Both of these sides of the bridge are necessary for us to develop reading comprehension. With many of our students, because of all that you've heard with the difficulties in cognitive load, language, and then also with the way we program words through orthographic mapping, if we do not have that word recognition piece in place, it begins to fall down. And as it falls, the language comprehension begins to crumble. So we have to be very thoughtful in our instruction to be sure that both sides of the bridge are supporting each other. And one of the dangers that we get into as educators is that as students go up the grade level, we haven't really built that word recognition strength and that on that side of the bridge. But there's a lot of pressure for the language comprehension because the content has become more complex for them. And this is the true danger for those students because we almost forget to go back and help them with the word recognition component, and we become very focused on the language comprehension because that is the most critical need that is being impressed upon us as educators at that time. Becky has found a way to work with her students at her school to make tremendous progress with reading and overcome these 4 difficulties of reading the English language. So Becky, I'm going to let you step back in right now and tell us the story.
Thank you, Tammy. If you would please go ahead and read the quote that's in front of you from Dr. Shaywitz. So in thinking about a knowledge gap, that I guess this speaks to me and tells me that now that we know everything that we know about this brain research, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do with our practice? So here at our school here at Templeton, we adopted a pilot 3 years ago called Readable English as an intervention. We used it with a small population of our 3rd grade students. And then last year, we expanded that pilot a little bit to 3rd and 4th grade. And then this year, we're using it for all students 3rd through 6th in Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention. Now, I've had the good fortune of being a part of this profession for 25 years, and 18 of those have been as a principal. And the one thing that I found is that there is a pattern with intervention. And it seems that very few students who find themselves into the Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention cycle, it's not very often that many of them are promoted or graduate from that cycle. Yes, they see growth. And yes, growth is imperative because growth is what it takes for these students to move into that virtuous learning cycle that Tammy mentioned. However, as the leader in the school, it's imperative that I not just look at that growth. We have to look at that growth and celebrate it, but we also have to begin having conversations about how are we going to get our students to grade level. So last winter, when COVID happened and it changed everyone's world, this particular company decided to create a virtual platform for this intervention in about a week's time. So the teaching and learning process was able to be sustained through the end of the school year. That, coupled with the evidence that we were seeing in 2 small pilots at my school, I decided I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about this intervention. So this past summer, I participated in all of the training. I can teach in person, I can teach virtually. I participated in all of the coaching sessions for teachers as well as coaching sessions for principals. And I currently teach 3 groups right now in my own school. And I have to tell you that every day they amaze me. And there are 3 really important and powerful things that I want to make sure I share with you that I have found specifically this year in teaching these students. First of all, self-esteem, self-confidence, and intrinsic motivation is almost immediate. They recognize they can be readers. And that in itself is what helps propel them once again into that virtuous learning cycle that we keep talking about. Secondly, it is imperative that students are reading grade level material. And within 5 weeks of teaching all the components of this intervention, our students have access to grade level material. Now, we all know how important that is, but I think I had forgotten exactly just how important it was until I saw the group I was teaching in 5th grade reading the same chapter book, Maniac McGee, as their peers. And their involvement in the class and their volunteering to ask questions and even volunteering to read aloud was something that had just not happened before. And our kids are very smart. We all know that when it's time to do small groups and leveled readers, they know they're coming to the table with a book that's smaller than others, the font is larger, and many times they still have pictures. So for them to be able to read and access the same material as their peers is incredibly powerful. And lastly, and most importantly, it is hope. I have found this intervention to allow students who have had the most amount of problem and lack of success have the greatest amount of success now because they'll tell you they can read. They've had the longest trouble, and now they say things like accomplishment. I just read accomplishment. I'm a reader. And they say it out loud and they say, I can read. And for me, and I'm sure all of you, that is the most important part of what we do, making sure our students are readers. And I want to walk through some of our data and share with you some of the successes that we've had. This first slide is from 2018. And in Indiana, we have an assessment called I Read 3. And it's part of what I would consider it our state's report card. And all students in third grade, they want to measure their performance in reading. So at our school, we decided that we wanted our tier 3 students to receive this extra support and this intervention. So everyone, tier 2 and tier 3, had their standard typical tier 2 support, whether it be in comprehension or phonemic awareness, fluency, whatever it might be, very skill supported. But we did add to all the students that were a year and a half to 2 years behind in reading, we added Readable English. And so at the end of the year, we're sitting in our conference room and we're disaggregating our data. And we were looking at student names. And by the time we finished, we realized that every single student in tier 3 that had this intervention had passed I Read 3. The next year, we take exact path at our school corporation, and we take it 3 times a year. Of course, we didn't get any end of year data, but this does represent fall to winter from 2019 to 2020. And if you'll note in the center, the bar graph in the center talks about expected growth, and it's what they feel all students should obtain between that fall to winter. I also do want to share that this data slide is exempt of any of our high ability students as they take a different assessment altogether. To the left on the bar graph, you note that it says non-readable English. So these are our students that do not receive any tiered support. They grew at 36.7. So we were very close. We were so close, but we were just under the expected growth mark. If you look to the right in the orange bar at 61.7, that was the average growth of the students that have received this intervention and the increase in their scale score. They were growing at about 1.5 times their grade level peers. And we just disaggregated winter data for 2021, and the results we're finding are nearly the same or very close to this slide that I'm showing you right now. Now this quote, I don't know, it may seem a little cheeky, but when we were going through all of the data, we were looking for gaps and holes, and we went through every single student that had participated in this intervention, and we're like growing, positive attitude, comes to school all the time. We were looking at all these positives about it, and I was like, oh my goodness, the only time it doesn't work is when we don't use it. And it's kind of become my catchphrase because it's true. It's really true. And lastly, before I turn it back over to Tammy, every school and every state has, their expectations of following like your adopted curriculum, and your school board decides that and votes on that for you. And what's really great about this, once the intervention is taught, it becomes a beautifully blended and flexible part of your language and reading blocks. In Indiana, we have a 90-minute block, and it's, of course, includes all the components, and those are mostly similar across all states. But what I would share is that whatever curriculum you currently are using, this can really become a very integrated part of what you're already doing. And with good core instruction and good curriculum, and this as a solid intervention, we're seeing great results. So I really appreciate you letting me share today, Tammy, some of our successes. And at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Tammy Miller.
Thank you, Becky. Every time I talk to you or hear from you, I am inspired by what is possible for our students. So we ask ourselves, what are we going to do about this problem? Well, one thing that we need to do is teach reading in a way that makes it easier for them to read accurately, to develop strong fluency and strong comprehension. And we need to eliminate all of these factors that make it hard. So in the English language, we've talked about all of these complexities, but what if we could remove them? What if the word had syllable breaks that helped us pronounce the word the way it's actually supposed to be pronounced? What if the words or the letters that we don't pronounce were grayed out? And what if the letters that have multiple pronunciations had a symbol that told us exactly what sound it would make, and there were never any exceptions, and it was always the same? We might be able to get more accuracy with our words, and it could eliminate a lot of the confusion. So, for example, with the word yacht, if you didn't know the word yacht, you might think it says yatchet. But what if we actually made those same types of changes? Grayed out the letters that are not pronounced, like the CH, and perhaps there would be a symbol above the A for the ah sound. We actually could pronounce that word correctly, and all of a sudden, it's phonetic. So English has become phonetic. Take a look at this chart. These are visual cues, and they can also be referred to as glyphs. And notice most interestingly about these glyphs, if you look down the center column, you will see a glyph. First of all, these glyphs all have a mnemonic name to help remember them, but that glyph shows up over multiple letters. It's always the same sound, regardless of the letter that it appears above. And there are only 21 of them. You only have to know those 21 symbols in order to be able to read 99% of the English language. It makes it phonetic. And it eliminates a lot of the complexities and the difficulties in the brain of losing that information and not ever getting it to the long-term memory or not ever getting it to access meaning. If you're imagining this idea that we're talking about as a possibility, and you think about having, preventing this fossilization of words being incorrectly stored because they haven't been spelled correctly when we're looking at them and we haven't pronounced them correctly, just imagine what could happen if we had a pronunciation guide or a built-in pronunciation guide for these words that have the correct spelling, the syllable breaks in the way we say the word, and the letters that we don't pronounce are grayed out. And remember, there's only 21 of those symbols that would have to be remembered for that process to happen, for the accuracy to improve. It's like a shortcut. The shortcut to the brain, in the brain, for that orthographic mapping process, and the words just don't get lost. So it's that built-in pronunciation guide that decreases the cognitive load. So you notice in the words cove, love, and move, if you followed the magic E rule, you would think that these words would sound similar, but they don't. In fact, each of the O's has a different symbol above, making it clear that it's a different pronunciation. So you see the dome above the O makes cove, the upper cup above the O in love, and then you have two moons above the O in the word move. So I mentioned earlier John Sweller, Professor John Sweller of the University of New South Wales in Australia. He is truly the father of cognitive load, the father of cognitive load theory. And as I said earlier, many cognitive psychologists and educational experts believe that the cognitive load theory is essentially the most important thing that we should know as educators about the learning process in the brain. We're going to hear from John Sweller briefly now, as he's considered all of these adaptations that we could make in helping our students learn to read better, and his opinion of that in regard to the cognitive load theory.
The whole point of cognitive load theory is how do we assist students to transfer information from working memory to long-term memory. And that's exactly what Readable English is doing. It's making it, as far as I can see, dramatically easier to transfer information from working memory to long-term memory. And a normal, competent adult reader is a normal, competent adult reader precisely because they've transferred previously, during many years of learning, an enormous amount of information from working memory into long-term memory. The advantage of Readable English is, it's ironic in a way, you don't have to transfer as much information from working memory into long-term memory because of the nature of Readable English. It reduces the amount of information that needs to be transferred. Because it reduces the amount of information that needs to be transferred, you learn to read English quicker and more easily.
At this time, we're going to do just a brief pause to take a couple of questions. We will come back after those questions to really show you the patented technology. It goes much beyond what we've shown you so far. And like I said, I've never seen anything work like this in my 35 years, and it's totally innovative. So let's go to Paul now for those questions.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. Yeah, we're getting a lot of really great questions, and many of them are about the Readable English tool. I know we have a few slides queued up after the brief question and answer, so I'll defer those questions about how the tool works to those slides. So, Tammy, I'm trying to kind of aggregate some of these questions here, and I didn't hear this in the presentation, and I'm wondering if you have any information on if the NAEP data tells us that 2/3 of students are struggling to read, 1/3 is doing fine. What makes those students different? Do you have any insights into what makes proficient students different from the ones who struggle?
Well, the biggest problem is that it's not an intelligence issue, but they often feel that it is. It's almost a miracle when those of us who have learned to read without difficulties did, because the brain is simply not programmed to do so. The biggest problem for those students is we have not yet provided the instruction or the intervention to that group of students that is going to allow them to read with the accuracy and then develop the fluency and comprehension that they deserve to be able to do. Reading is a right. It's a right like every citizen deserves the ability to be able to read, and that's our responsibility, our moral imperative, and we can do it. We have ways to accomplish this for them.
Tammy and Becky, we're also getting other questions about the range by which this technique can be applied, this Readable English. So what do we do for K2 students? Because Becky shared grade 3 data. And I'm also getting questions about what do we do for high school and even alternative education students?
Well, I can tell you our experience has been that adults have had success with the program. And we'll go into more detail about this in the last part of the presentation, but it really can happen very fast. It doesn't take that long for the students to acquire the background knowledge of the program in order to apply it and make it work. Second grade through adulthood is really, I've seen it work with all. We had great success with the first grade in a rural Indiana community. There were some Title I students in this pullout group that were using the program, and it was interesting. The first grade teachers, there were 4 first grade teachers came to the Title I teachers who were providing the intervention in reading. And they said, you know, these kids are already performing better now than the rest of the kids. So could you just give us back those kids? And we would like you to take some different kids now. So when she called me, she asked, can we just take some different kids? And I said, oh no, we want to keep that data going, but let's give the program to all the kids in first grade. Mm-hmm. So of the 4 teachers, 3 took it. 1 was retiring and decided not to enter into a new endeavor. And at the end of the school year, what was ironic is that the students who had begun with the program in their Title I service in August, by the end of the year on Dibble, had gained over 8 levels. And what I have read about Dibble is that 8 levels is about a year's worth of growth. The students who came close to 8 levels, they grew 6.5 levels. These were the students that had the program starting in January. And the students who grew the least, which was 5.5 levels or 5.6, actually never got the program. So that was the first grade example. And we have many examples of alternative education. We're currently using it also in adult education, middle school, high school. Many schools are now starting to also use this in second grade because second grade is where that cognitive load is almost overwhelming or unrealistic.
Becky, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would add that it flows even more beautifully if all the standard sounds of the alphabet as well as the 12 standard blends have been learned. And once those students have that mastered, then the layering of this intervention on top of that seems to be a perfect blend. This first grade group actually had done a really good job of learning the majority of their letter sounds and their blends while they were also learning the intervention. So we have seen it work both ways.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what, we're getting fantastic questions. I'm just going to make a quick ask people to take a note, and you'll see this email address in a few minutes also. If we don't get to your question, please ask us by emailing us at info@readableenglish.com. And again, between Readable and English, there's only one E. So readableenglish.com, you'll see that email address in our website again later. But Tammy and Becky, I think the questions now that I'd like to get to, because there are so many, have to do with coding and uncoding using the Readable English tool. And I know you have some slides that can help explain how this process works. So I think we should get right to those.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I want to use this time to make sure they can see the wonderful invention that's changing lives. So introducing Readable English. We've dropped some hints about it, so you've probably picked up on it, and that's what it's called, and that's the book that was given to me 5 years ago that began this journey. Readable English is really like training wheels for learning how to read. And here's where I really want you to see the magic that happens with Readable English. In order to get these words accurately, you have to have the BLISS system. It's only 21. Consider 353 rules and exceptions that have to be memorized just to read 1,000 words. And then even with that, you might not be correct. But with 21 symbols, you're right every time. You get the accuracy. What happens with this conversion technology, as you see here, is that it converts the Readable English into a font. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. When I first saw that particular font and the tool, I was extremely impressed. But my first question was, well, do you have to have a conversion tool to be able to read? And the answer is no. That is why I left my very cush position to go out into the field to test this myself, because I wanted to know with certainty that students weren't going to have to walk around with a conversion tool to be able to read. To go back to the brain that we talked about, what happens in the brain is that those words, once they have been identified, they're transferred to the long-term memory, but they have to be transferred accurately. So with the built-in pronunciation guide of Readable English, with the spelling kept intact, those two critical elements allow us to pronounce the words correctly. So we see it correctly with the spelling, we say it correctly with the pronunciation guide, and then in our brains, we hear it correctly. When that information enters the brain through the word box, and then there is an explosion of either going up into the orange arrow portion of the brain that is unclear whether or not we will ever be able to attach sound, pronunciation, and meaning, or if it goes straight to the frontal lobe. With Readable English, it goes straight to the frontal lobe. So the more you read with the conversion tool, the faster you grow your word bank and the faster you grow your word volume, which then improves your fluency. So no, it is not a crutch. I would not waste your time or anyone's talking about something that would become a crutch. But what it does do is it provides quick access so that students learn to read faster. And also for students who are behind, as Becky described when she talked about Maniac McGee, students can now suddenly begin to read the same text as their peers. So I had an 8th grade student who was a special education student, and he suddenly turned around all of his grades, but he was still struggling with math. While I was working with him one day, I suggested that he start to put his directions in the conversion tool for math, and he started doing that. He then gained the academic vocabulary, increased his fluency and comprehension of what the math problems were asking him to do. He had great success from that point forward. So the magic of this, and something that makes it unlike anything else that's ever been invented for reading purposes, is the fact that this is brain compatible, as you heard with John Sweller. It reduces the cognitive load, and when you put it in the conversion tool, it's a direct path to that long-term memory, building the word bank with accuracy, which builds the fluency and the comprehension. It's somewhat miraculous, I know, but it works. So if you take a look here, this is just a map on our website. Every student receives their own personal login to the website. There are practice modules for fluency and accuracy, and then also for comprehension. So the 5 components of reading are really throughout all of the work that you do with Readable English, including the phonemic awareness, the phonics, the comprehension, and vocabulary and fluency are all built in. The important thing to know about this too is that the glyphs take about 5 weeks. I just had a teacher actually tell me that all of her students learned the glyphs in 2 weeks. So it's a matter of just internalizing those glyphs. And I like to say, learn the glyphs as fast as you can and then start reading. I did see a question. Someone asked if there was confusion that was caused from the glyphs. Actually, 100% of the time, there has not been confusion. There has been clarity. Even in the first grade classroom, students were able to then get better clarity about the sounds that the letters were making when they were introduced to the system. So all of that to say that Readable English helps land those words into the long-term memory with that quick transfer to standard English. So it's a shortcut to getting the words into that visual word box to change lives. The transfer occurs quickly. And I wanted to just plant the seed for you as well. If you think about the data that Becky showed, she was showing you that her Tier 3 students, 3rd grade students, her Tier 3 students who took the state IREAD 3 test and multiple years behind in reading, all passed the state test after using Readable English. Her Tier 2 students did not have Readable English. Both Tier 2 and Tier 3 had the same intervention, but Tier 2 did not have Readable English. And none of her Tier 2 students who were closer to grade level passed the state test. So what does that tell you? You do not have to have the conversion tool to read. None of the 3rd grade students from Becky's school were allowed to use the conversion tool on the state test. Just like none of the students who passed their state end of course assessment to get a diploma using Readable English use the conversion tool. That's further evidence of the transfer effect. Again, the other beautiful
feature of this is that students quickly begin to believe that they can read. At Becky's school 2 years ago, a young man approached his teacher and said, "Hey, by the way, I can read now." I had a middle school teacher have a 7th grade student tell her the same thing. It simply begins to build that confidence. They now have a system and a way that they know they can decode with accuracy, and they begin to build confidence because they're actually building their fluency at the same time. They feel successful. You're going to get chapter 2 from this book. This is the book that changed my life, and it's changing the lives of many students. The authors, Chris Stevens and Ann Fitz, put this system together. Ann Fitz built Readable English. She's the inventor and the founder. She's a reading expert, and it's phenomenal what she has been able to do that is impacting the reading crisis in this country today. Please enjoy reading chapter 2. It's all about the brain, the reading brain, and the entire book is available on our website as well. And I'm also happy, Paul, if there is anyone who wants to stick around for questions, I'd be happy to help with that. I'm sure Becky would too.
I have a question about when you stop using the glyphs.
Basically, what I was trying to get across is that, yes, it sticks. It's not a crutch. It's not a short-term Band-Aid approach. It does stay in the brain in the long-term memory. It does not take long to learn the glyphs, and my experience has been that students are not confused by the glyphs. They're actually encouraged, and it helps provide confidence that they can now pronounce the words correctly. So they love learning the glyphs. It's fun. And they also love the fact that it empowers them with reading.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm being asked about the implication for students with autism and dyslexia. Is that something you can talk about?
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Jillian Coggins is she's basically a dyslexia expert, and she has a lot of experience with neuroscience and reading. When she learned about Readable English, and basically she and I were both presenting at a state superintendent's conference in 2019, I shared Readable English with her. She immediately saw the value. She came on board, and what she did, she actually reached out to students that she had taught in the past when she was a special education teacher, and they were dyslexic. They had been labeled with dyslexia. She began teaching them Readable English online. The growth that they made was astonishing to her. One student in particular started working with her. I believe he was a middle school student, and as a middle school student, he had about maybe under 20 words. And after 6 weeks of working with her, he had 69 words, and he was extremely, very dyslexic. So yes, we have had success, and we could even arrange a time for you to talk to Dr. Coggins if that would be helpful. Also, by the way, sorry, Paul, I just realized too, we are working with the International Dyslexia Association toward their accreditation, and we're hoping that we can get that finalized by the fall.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Thank you. Here's a question that kind of gets to the heart of everything, and I'm still getting a lot of good questions. I hope we can keep going here. Is this something that would be implemented school-wide or just for tiers 2 and 3? And I think that's a really good question that we get outside of this webinar. We get this question a lot. So how would you like to address that?
Becky, would you like to go for it as a building principal?
Yes. The good news is it could be for either. We started with a small pilot, which was why it was a small population, and then we grew and grew again to this year. But dependent upon your population, absolutely, it could be something that you implement across your whole school. We've seen schools that have done that in Indiana, and they've had some great success. And even though they're learning and growing, it can be very valuable. I think it really depends on your demographics. I think it depends on your need. But for us, it seemed like a perfect place to start with our tier 2 and tier 3 population. Tammy?
Yeah, I think, what's so interesting is that typically when we start talking about Readable English, we often will start with a small population for intervention. And then after 1 to 3 years, you start to see that the school has expanded, and they continue to expand because they begin to realize that they can get students to perform faster and at higher levels. So, for example, last night during the Super Bowl, second grade teacher calls me up, and she is ecstatic because she used the conversion tool in a context clue lesson, and she decided to take a risk. She gave her second graders a text with the conversion tool that was at a fifth grade reading level. She showed them the passage with the glyph, and they were all able to read it. All of her second graders were able to read it because they had the glyph. That they began to talk about the vocabulary. She went deeper with comprehension. She then had given them the same text in standard English, and only 4 of her students were able to read it. So yes, and it's both. It's intervention, and it can be used with all students and in conjunction with your other reading materials.
Absolutely.
And so that kind of leads into another question about pricing, and I won't talk specifics because it's going to require a conversation with your school and with you who's participating. So I again encourage you to email us at info@readableenglish.com or paul@readableenglish.com. I'm also getting a question about whether this could work for tutoring. I'm also getting a question about the training aspect for the program. So here's how I'm going to ask you to address this. I know we have a rate for a one-off. So if a tutor wanted to use this, it's my understanding they could, and we will provide what's necessary for you. But really, what we're really doing is we're pricing this per student license. And so the size of the cohort and whether it's a district-wide or school-wide adoption, those are all factors that go in. But also, could you talk, Tammy, you might elaborate on that, or maybe you can just tell us about the training aspect. So when we implement this, and how do we deliver training for the program?
Right. So a couple of things. One is that on the pricing, we have tried to offer the reduced price regarding the number of students that are signing up and for the number of years that you sign up. And then a second piece to keep in mind is that we're noticing that in the second year of implementation, some students really only need the conversion tool. And so we are prepared to accommodate students that only need the conversion tool in the following years of implementation. And in regard to the training, everyone, the way we have packaged this is that we do all of the training for you for free, and we can do that, online or in person. But we have also provided another opportunity in coaching. And our coaching has been going miraculously well because we are working with teachers. We implement a data collection system for them to help learn about getting kids to grade level. And that becomes the focus of our work with a coach, as well as the implementation of Readable English. But then we marry that with good reading instruction and getting our kids to grade level in both comprehension and word fluency, words accurate per minute.
Great. Okay, so we've reached the end of what the presentation. By the way, everybody's going to be receiving an email that includes Chapter 2 of Readable English, and the book is also available on our website. Here's our contact information. You can reach Tammy, or you can reach me, our first name at readableenglish.com. If you'd like to see more information, we can use my calendar link to schedule another conversation. Okay, thank you. I really think that's going to cover the questions the best we're able to in this format. So I'm putting up again our contact information. And again, also there's more information that you can access at readableenglish.com. So at this point, I think I'd like to conclude this. And thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Becky, for sharing all your insights with us. And thank you all to all the participants. We're getting some fantastic feedback. We've loved the questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. We hope you'll follow up with us. And if we do have a follow-up webinar, we'll be sure to get back with you and let you know how to access that as well. So thank you. It's the end of the day here on the East Coast. So I wish you all a safe trip home if you're not at home already. And we hope to see you soon and hear from you soon.
Thank you all so much.